With regret, Vale Ian Jones, 2nd of July 1948 to 1st of July 2023. Ian Jones was born in Bendigo in 1948 and was educated at Brighton High School, Monash University and RMIT. When he joined the club, he was given the classification Building Technology, and his expertise included acoustics, vibration, thermodynamics and wind engineering.
President and members, it's my great pleasure to introduce Bevan Warner, who is the CEO of Launch Housing. Is that right? As you all know, Launch is the biggest and most influential homelessness agency in Victoria. Our club has long identified homelessness as a key priority, and to that end we have a lengthy association with Launch and its predecessor organisation. Our current Make a House a Home project was carefully developed with Launch 6 years ago in 2017 and is now going into its 7th year. So we have a long association and a current association with Launch. Since 2017, we've assisted some hundreds of Launch's most needy clients. In homelessness, you need very deep pockets to make a material difference. But I'm pretty sure that no other Rotary Club in Australia has made a more meaningful, modest contribution in this difficult space. Bevan is accompanied today by Ellie Holdsworth, who does a marvellous job of liaising with us, the volunteers, and coordinating between us and the individual frontline officers of Launch. So we get our boxes and our sets of boxes coordinated and where they're needed at the time they're needed. So a big welcome to Ellie and thank you for your work. Could I now ask you all to welcome Bevan to address us today?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for the long-standing relationship and the contribution. Richard mentioned the Make Home project, which results in starter packs for people who are moving from homelessness to a secure home, often for the first time or in a long time. And that starter pack contains a whole lot of essentials, often 2 big boxes. And in addition to the sort of practical benefits of plates and knives and forks and the things that sort of make an empty unit the beginning of a home, that practical benefit is accompanied by an emotional connection for the recipient to understand that there are people out there in the community who care enough about their well-being to be involved in that very thoughtful act. So what you're doing makes a material difference to the people we're helping, and it also goes a long way to addressing their sense of dislocation from the community by pulling them in with that feeling that other people care, which is very, very important. Wonderful to be able to have lunch with people, particularly people who share an interest in the cause. Thank you, Peter, for that wonderful reflection. 65 years, yes, started in Hanover Street, Fitzroy, moved down to Old Gordon House, which is now an Airbnb at the top of Little Burke Street. Henry Bolte thought all those dishevelled men were a bit of a sort of distraction from from Spring Street and sort of wanted to push it further down the hill, and there was a big community campaign against that. We ended up with a much grander and bigger Shake the Tin 220 bed crisis facility on the site of New Gordon House, which Jeff Kennett reclaimed to build the casino, and we ended up with at the time a state-of-the-art 1982 52-bed crisis facility in Hague Street, tucked behind the casino, and a whole lot of transitional housing in the community. So our history is very long. We now employ 400 staff. We assisted 15,000 people last year. The idea of what was then Hanover was to be brave, follow the evidence, do what was right, not what was popular. Hanover followed the evidence and pioneered harm minimisation policies at the time. We still like to think that the modern incarnation of Hanover now, through a combination of Hanover and Homeground, which became Launch Housing 8 years ago, continues the best of that tradition. And the idea of Launch Housing is that we want to end homelessness, not just make the experience of it less harsh for people. Ending homelessness in Victoria seems like a big task. We can't do it alone, but we do know a lot about what ends homelessness, and it's more homes and more support, and we know we can't achieve that by ourselves, so we need partners. So Rotary are a really important part and demonstration of that connection to community. We also believe that we should not forsake people who are doing it really tough, the hard end of street homelessness, if you like, and that the idea of ending homelessness, if we can't do it ourselves, we must example what works and invite other people to take that to scale, whether that's federal or state governments to invest in certain solutions, or other community agencies or organisations to replicate and emulate what we know works in other places. So in addition to the Make Home project this year, you may not know that we commissioned a 60-unit facility, $30 million project in Dandenong during the last financial year, exclusively for women and children who are escaping prolonged and acute family violence. So 60 mothers, 140 children, safely housed in a architecturally designed supportive housing accommodation project with in-reach supports to deal with the developmental delay and the trauma that children have experienced by being exposed to family violence and without secure housing. So achieving amazing results already. At the opening, a young mother told me that her 7-year-old son had slept through the night a couple of nights ago for the first time in their life, and they had been living in what is called Viv's Place after our first female social worker, Viv McCutcheon. And so that's remarkable results, but Rotary was there fitting out and donating all of the ground floor furniture, all of the soft furnishings and fittings to make that place a home. So, you're in there and you've been there a long time, and long may it continue. And wow, 4,900 and something meetings is a great history. I also want to remark, Peter, that the spirit of Alan Jordan lives on. So we have an Alan Jordan Scholarship. Alan pioneered that brave, follow the evidence, do what's right, not what's popular. We recently, in April of this year, we sent 3 young caseworkers, social workers, all women, to North America and Canada for a 3-week, individualised 3-week study tours of community organisations dealing with housing and homelessness across Vancouver and North America. And so they're bringing back world's best practice to us to apply back in our work here. The idea of Launch Housing is to work from end to end. So we don't want to be the biggest community housing provider, and we don't want to simply deliver support services and not do housing, because you can only end homelessness with housing and support. And so it's a big task that we've set for ourselves, because we're operating street-based outreach services as we speak. We're one of the leading organisations doing outreach into the CBD and engaging with people who are sleeping rough. We run 4 crisis centres, a family-specific one where we, following the harm minimisation approach, where we accommodate people that other crisis services won't. There's a lot of alcohol and drug use. There's a lot of comorbidity, substance use and mental health issues in the group of people we're assisting. But if we're not for them, who else would be? At the same time, we're trying to transform lives by working with women and children at Viv's Place, with the Royal Women's Hospital, with our pregnancy outreach program that is picking up women who are in violent relationships, disclose that they're pregnant, exposed at that point in their time to great risks of violence and becoming homeless and pregnant on the streets, and working with the social work and outreach teams from the Women's Hospital and ourselves to provide secure housing and housing pathways for those women and children. So we're working from end to end. And I guess what I wanted to reflect on is a little bit about the pandemic. So we learnt through the pandemic that our own health is intimately connected to the health of the person next to us, and we're all either confined or had some moment where we were thinking about, home was more important because we were restricted in where we could go. And we detected an outbreak in empathy in the community. We got good research about that. And certainly the response when our own health needs were compromised by the potential transmission risks of people who were sleeping rough, or the risk to those people themselves who had often had poor health outcomes of contracting COVID and potentially with very serious complications. Government moved heaven and earth, and we temporarily housed people. We saw the economic benefits of underwriting the risks of a recession. We announced the big build. We're on the way to deliver 12,000 extra social housing units in Victoria. That was coming off a very low base. Victoria was spending less than half the national average on social housing as all the other states. That's a really odd situation for a very progressive, proudly Victorian state that often sees itself at the forefront of social policy issues. Despite the big build, we've only sort of added 74 houses in the last couple of years to stock because it takes time. And as you're adding stock, you're also sort of knocking old stuff down and planning to rebuild it. So there's a rosy future, but it's going to take a long, long time. And on a positive note, we've seen housing affordability, rent stress, cost of living become a white-hot issue politically. So it's now sort of, one of the 2 or 3 political issues that dominate the landscape and are dominating the discussion between the parties, and there's big proposals and big legislation being debated or delayed, whichever way you want to see it. But the big change is we no longer have to sort of clamour for attention for the issue, because the issue is front and centre, because it's affecting everybody, not just those homeless people over there. And I'll come back to stigma and othering. So something is going to happen with public investment in social and community housing, and that's long overdue. It probably won't happen quickly enough, and there are risks in the politicisation of middle Australia and the desire to make sure that lifters and leaners and my taxes and who benefits, that becomes a housing response for affordable housing, for key workers, for how we want to have our cities, and to another way of sort of subsidising sort of low income or middle Australia and getting a toehold in the housing market. And perversely, the outcome that I fear is that big political discussion about housing and housing affordability results in more public investment in housing and paradoxically an increase in homelessness at the same time, because governments are prone to want to invest in sure things like capital, which they can sort of count once. They don't really like to invest in the ongoing or recurrent cost of services to support people to sustain a good housing outcome. So when I talk a little bit about homelessness, it's getting worse. So the census from 2021 compared to 2016, a 24% increase in homelessness in Victoria over that 5-year period. Biggest increase in young people and children and women over 55. We're seeing a 25% increase in the post-pandemic environment in the last 18 months of people coming to us for emergency relief and rent assistance to get past arrears to stay in their homes so they don't become homeless. And so it's a 25% increase in the amount of money we're paying, on top of a 25% increase in the number of people who are coming to us. In terms of the difficulty that we have in doing the work and the employer's obligations around a safe and inclusive workplace or staff wellbeing, which is quite a separate issue to the frightful perils that a lot of our clients are in. We're handing out 45 sleeping bags a month. And in terms of triaging relative vulnerability, if someone discloses in an interview to us that they own a car, we would consider that they could sleep safely in the car with the doors locked, and we would move past them and go to someone else who's in more dire circumstances. So we are part of an unfair service system through want of resources, both staff resources and housing to place people in, where we are entrenching people and perpetuating cumulative harm in homelessness. So about 25% of people who experience homelessness are at risk of chronic homelessness or being entrenched in homelessness. 3/4 of people who have experienced homelessness will do so once or for a short time, and through reliance on friends or families or just restocking themselves will claw their way out and sort of sustain themselves without coming back to us again. The 25% of people who get entrenched in homelessness, the difficulty here is it the mental health issue that causes the homelessness, or is it the pain and trauma of the homelessness that creates the mental health issue? And does the mental health issue and the trauma of homelessness, which results in self-medication and some substance use, or becomes a substance use issue, which compounds the mental health issue because what are you treating first, the mental health issue or the substance use issue? So the costs to the individual of allowing them to become entrenched in homelessness, let alone the costs to the community through programs that just don't work as effectively when someone doesn't have the security of housing, is astronomical. We know that it costs more to treat homelessness in the street than it does to provide housing and support. And that evidence is internationally peer reviewed, and it's not really controversial through any Treasury department. So you've got to ask yourself the question, why aren't we ending homelessness? And it comes down to stigma, because, and I will mention something you might want to Google, the just world hypothesis or the just world fallacy. I can hear my father parenting me as a child. If you try again, eventually you'll succeed, or everyone gets their just desserts. The way we think about Australian egalitarianism and meritocracy is that we like to think that everyone sort of finds their own place in the world according to their merits. And that's the just world hypothesis. And you can, there's lots of ways that we reinforce that. And when you think about that as some unifying moral type of code, I think it's perfectly sensible. What it doesn't make allowance for are the structural factors, whether it's poverty, the intergenerational poverty that is place-based in Australia, the education inequity, the fact that we've moved to a highly casualised, insecure workforce. Those structural factors which are drivers into homelessness, particularly when you have 1% of vacancies in Australia considered affordable according to the Anglicare Rental Affordability Index, or when you have episodes of violence, no one asked to be a victim of some random act of sexual violence, or no one asks to be a child who grows up in a family where it's unsafe. So when you have exposure to trauma, and when you have poverty, and when you have an overheated housing market, and when Victoria has 2.3% of all of its housing stock as public or community housing, compared to London, which has 25%, or other international countries where there's a lot more investment in social housing, we have the recipe for homelessness to become entrenched for a proportion of people who will experience homelessness at least once in their life. And it's that entrenching the homelessness and the cumulative harm that presents to individuals and families, and the cost to the community, that gets me up at night to sort of keep going with the work that we're doing. And I want to just talk a little bit about stigma, because when you have this just world hypothesis that we've all somehow been socialised into, and when we have an idea that is part of the colonisation of Australia, that we can just spread out and acquire land, and land is a way to private wealth creation, which is not as present in some European cultures. Vienna has 60% of all housing in Vienna is community owned. The way in which you get ahead in some countries in Europe is not through property speculation, it's through industry and endeavour. It's to set up a business and to own shares. But in Australia, we have a different tradition. And the problem with that, I work hard. Yes, I accept that government has a responsibility to underwrite a basic universal healthcare system, which is a proudly Australian idea. and a good quality public education system. There's no consensus in Australia that the government has a role in underwriting housing, because most people might think that that's a private endeavour or a private responsibility. So we're very quick to other people, and we've had 10, 15 years of political debate about lifters and leaners, where we sort of segment people into the sort of worst aspects of the American tradition of politics, which is sort of highly to polarise things rather than to unite things. So stigma that some people have made poor choices for their homelessness or want to be homeless is what's preventing the rational action that government needs to take to follow the evidence, to invest in more social housing and more supports to end homelessness. So what Launch Housing is doing now, and I've sort of will move a little bit towards maybe opening it up for questions, is we're intentionally framing a campaign called Melbourne Zero. And Melbourne Zero is an aspiration to say, why shouldn't Melbourne be a world-leading city in ending homelessness? Homelessness, when you think about it as a problem that you see around the world in other places, when you see entrenched problems like comorbidity, substance use and mental health issues, it looks so big to be insoluble. And what we're trying to do is break it down to give it a place, to give it an identity. And we're saying, proudly Melbourne, which considers itself to be an outward-looking, internationally progressive city, which has got some amazing character traits, which is the home of the Australian Open. We have world-class motorsport. We have world-class biotech industry. We're a world-class destination for international students. We've got world-class defence industry capability coming along. Why couldn't we be a world-leading city in ending homelessness? So we have a Melbourne Zero campaign, which I encourage you to find on Google search, and it's a campaign that's designed to bridge out of the funded service sector. We work with the Salvos, we work with Vincent Care, we work with CoHealth, we work with the nurses, we work with St Vincent's Hospitals. Everyone who works in the system is busy working with each other trying to solve problems without enough resources, because there's not enough community belief that we can actually solve homelessness, despite the evidence to the contrary. So this Melbourne Zero campaign is unashamedly inviting businesses and brands to join the idea of why shouldn't Melbourne be a world-leading city in ending homelessness? What would have to happen for that to occur? About a month ago, we had Readings, an iconic Melbourne-based bookstore, who's a foundation member of the Melbourne Zero Network, curate a series of books and promote on their online platform to their regular customers a series of books that people could purchase that are not exclusively about homelessness, but touch on it as a way of engaging the community or giving people opportunities to learn more about the circumstances of others or where the solutions might fall. The other thing we're doing on the 7th of August is we'll be launching our Capital Cities Index, which is an exercise in comparing Melbourne's progress in ending homelessness against 9 other cities around the world: Adelaide and Sydney, Dublin, Vancouver, Toronto, London, New York and Dublin. I know where we rank, but I won't give that away yet. And that is a deliberate strategy to provoke a conversation amongst the broader Melbourne community who like to believe that last year, a couple of weeks ago, we were rated the 3rd most livable city in the world, but not for everyone, and that's a mark of pride for many people in the Melbourne community. Well, where do we rank against those other cities in ending homelessness? What are the causes? What are the drivers? What are the solutions? Let's have a conversation. Let's have a competition. Melburnians love a competition. We're outward looking. Let's not compete against Perth, where I come from, because we never look backwards to the west. We're too good for them anyway. Let's look further afield, the best in class around the world, and bring those best in class solutions here. And let's power up the imagination and the belief that solutions to homelessness do exist, because they do. Let's just demand that they get brought here to Melbourne. So we're defining Melbourne as the local government area covered by the City of Melbourne. We've got a very passionate and progressive Lord Mayor who wants to talk about these issues. And we need community, business and brands to join that movement. Realestate.com, another partner of Launch Housing, are a member of the Melbourne Zero Network. They're doing what they can in their online ads and the way in which people engage with their site to promote the website and the opportunity for people to engage. There's 20 odd suggestions that people and brands can participate in to inform themselves. One of those things is called the Roughing It Challenge, which is an opportunity for individuals, families and teams at work to have an experience of what it's like to live with $10 a day and without a bed for 24 hours, and to debrief that in family situations with conversation cards and discussion prompts, or in teams at work to think about, well, actually, if it's good business for brands to make sure that they're representing the community and their customers, then why wouldn't we do safe and inclusive workplace training through the Roughing It Challenge with our teams and get them more empathetic to the circumstances of people they might be walking past underneath the Flinders Street train station. I could go on and on and on, but I know I can't. And so I'd love to take questions. I'd love you to have a look at the melbournezero.org website. And most of all, I just want to say thank you for the ongoing and meaningful support the Rotary's contributed to Launch Housing and its predecessors over many, many, many years. Thank you.
Do you want to do it? I think we have a little bit of time for questions, but firstly, thank you, Bevan. You've been provocative, highly strategic, and different in relation to this issue, and most appreciated. Now, let's have some questions. I think...
Congratulations on that presentation. We're very impressed that no numbers, so very well done. You mentioned, well, I've been working in the city now for nearly 6 years. I've never seen it worse. Shocking. What sort of database do you have to know the success and the outcomes and working in with all the other agencies? I mean, every time I come in, I see from people lining up for partners. Is there a database of homeless people? Is it measured?
Great question. Yes and no. The funded service system doesn't really work that way. Perversely, the government funded service system doesn't work that way. We collect a lot of information about individuals, and then appropriate considerations around privacy legislation often means that doesn't get shared. And so there's no one true picture, and people have to retell their story. So that's not common. That's not uncommon in the social services system, but it's a problem. We've brought an international method from North America called Advanced to Zero, which involves a by name list at the regular street engagement with people, a by name list and information sharing protocols to have a regular weekly conversation with which agency is doing what for which person in the street. So we know, for instance, that last week there were 178 people sleeping rough in the CBD, and we know who they are and what their needs are, but we're funding that exclusively from philanthropy. So we've got a bottom-up approach called Functional Zero, Advanced to Zero, that we're working across 5 local government areas: the City of Port Phillip, the City of Dandenong, the City of Frankston. The City of Melbourne have been a bit of a hybrid for the last few years, and that's sort of meeting this top-down Melbourne Zero idea. If you don't count it, you can't measure it. If you don't have particulars about individuals, you can't particularise their support needs. So the virtue of it, the not-for-profit, is that we get to not accept the status quo and agitate a little bit and be a bit of a pebble in the shoe of the bureaucracy, but we also rely upon the bureaucracy to fund us. So we have to tread carefully about how much to call out the imperfections of the funded service system. But yeah, it's set up to fail at the moment, unfortunately. Yeah, so the former government rejected 50 odd years of bipartisanship around and basically said they don't have a role in social housing. We've now got the Albanese government, which is trying to pass the Housing Australia Future Fund. When that does, that'll eventually pass in some form. And the question that needs to be resolved in how they operationalise that is, how deep is the subsidy? Because if you charge 30% of someone's welfare payment as a social rent, then 30% of New Start is basically bugger all, and it doesn't finance the cost of the construction, and it certainly doesn't look after the life cycle maintenance of the building. So it has to be a top-up. Now, governments are all wedded to this public-private partnership model, so they're making it even more complicated by saying, we'll establish a build-to-rent industry and we'll get super funds involved. So there's got to be private capital in that deal making, and about 15 to 25%, and that patient capital has got to get a risk-adjusted return somewhere that get factored in. And so to get this new stock created in a predictable way, a model that sort of the market can follow, the federal government has to decide how deep the subsidy will be. And they've been coy on that because they haven't got the legislation passed. So we need the legislation, we need the Commonwealth to show the colour of its money by signalling to the market how deep the subsidy will be, and then everyone else can go and form consortia and find deals, and we can start piloting that scheme and developing the scale that we need. So there's no one pathway into or out of homelessness for any individual. There are commonalities. So poverty is one, so that can be intergenerational disadvantage. It can certainly be low educational attainment, casualised insecure work, irregular hours, together with some life event, small business failure. It can also be either separately or together an episode of major trauma, major health complications, underinsured, lack of family support, and those two things come together in an overheated rental market where there's massive undersupply of safety net public housing, and that's where we're getting people who are experiencing homelessness are coming to us for the first time, often working. So there's prevention strategies, and basically that's build more public housing and make sure that that's at a subsidised rent that's no more than 30% of someone's income, because we need the balance to manage life's essentials. And to do that, Australia's got to get way back up the scale of where the average in the OECD countries of social housing is about 8.7% of all housing stock. Australia's 3.4%. Some of the UK, Scotland is at the sort of 14, 16%, I think, when I last looked. Some cities are different, but so we've got massive undersupply of public housing, over-reliance on the private rental market. We've had things in the last 10 years like Airbnb and other things where stock is taken out of the rental market. A lot of homes are there for holiday rental and not for basic housing security. So we've got structural problems we need to address.
We're going to have to call it a close at that point. Bevan, I'm not even going to start to try and summarise the summary of the number of issues you've raised, but fantastic address for us, provocative, made us think, and showing everyone the complexity and number of interlinking variables in just even talking about this space. Now, I'm going to have to apologise to say I haven't got the Phil Endersby socks to hand over. We'll fix that somehow with Joe before you leave. And once again, thank you, and ask everyone to express their appreciation for your talk. Thank you. My task now is to thank visitors and guests for attending, and thanks for Peter Hollingsworth. Very nice little summary of the history leading into Bevan. That was brilliant, Peter. And ask that the setup and reception teams stay back, of course, for a few minutes to help if there's anyone who can be additional. There would be appreciated. A quick reminder for next week: our monthly meeting will be hosted and held at our corporate members Bionics Institute in East Melbourne. There'll be more online from Joe on that, and it remains now to ask you to all stand and for the national anthem to close the meeting. Thank you.